And could we have the first picture up, please? There we are. Can anyone see what might be wrong with this picture? Now, this can be a rhetorical question. That's fine. I'm quite happy to work with that. But if you've got any thoughts about what might be wrong with the picture, then now's your time. Okay. Well, my criticism of the accuracy of Caravaggio's painting, it was a bit of a rogue, by the way. He was on the run at one time, having been accused of murdering somebody in a brawl outside a bar. Well, who hasn't done that? Anyway, so what he shows here is Thomas putting his finger into the side of Jesus. But in the story that we read, simply seeing Jesus in the flesh, standing alive in front of him, was enough. He didn't need to poke inside Jesus' body to know that this was the man who had been crucified. And he could see that while he bore the marks of death on his side, on his hands, on his feet, he was now very much alive. In this painting, Caravaggio seems to have jumped to a conclusion, which is that Thomas took Jesus up on his offer to not just see, but also to feel for himself. The story that we read in John chapter 20 doesn't tell us either that Thomas did or did not touch Jesus. But my feeling is that seeing Jesus was enough, and that to do what Caravaggio has Thomas do in his painting was really quite unnecessary. Seeing was believing. You'll have probably heard preachers talk about Thomas in the past. He crops up most years after Easter, either that or Emmaus Road, one or the other, or the fish, the miraculous catch of fish. On the Sunday after Easter, Thomas is one of those who crops up. And then we hear about his so-called doubting. If you didn't already know, you will suspect that my sympathies actually lie quite firmly with Thomas. You might have heard a number of reasons for why Thomas was absent when Jesus came the first time, that he was too grief-stricken to meet with the others. He was a twin. Maybe he'd gone out to see his twin brother and to tell him what had happened, or that he'd just popped out to get a pint of milk. It was an inopportune moment. One does things, and then Jesus comes. We know little of the psychological makeup of the disciples. We know that Peter, James, and John tended to be on the impulsive side. But beyond them, we're rather clutching at straws. So what do we make of Thomas? Well, John records a couple of conversations that Jesus has with Thomas. In chapter 11, Jesus gets word that Lazarus is very ill, and his sisters want Jesus to come and do something, anything. The trouble is that their home in Judea is a dangerous place for Jesus to go. People were already plotting against him. And his disciples fear that Jesus would be killed if he went. Thomas shows no doubt. He doesn't show any unfaithfulness. He says that he's ready to go. He's ready to go and to die beside Jesus. Doubting? I don't think so. In chapter 14, the beginning of a long passage in which Jesus shares some final thoughts with his disciples, Jesus speaks of going to prepare a place for his followers. It's a passage that I've often read at funerals. I don't usually go on to the part where Thomas chimes in with a question which nobody else is willing to ask. Lord, I don't know where you're going, so how am I supposed to find the way? I think the problem is not so much a lack of desire to follow Jesus. We've seen that already. He'll follow him to the death. It's being too literal-minded. Thomas feels the need to know for himself and not to rely on hearsay evidence from elsewhere. And in this, although perhaps for different reasons, Thomas is not unlike the rest of the disciples. You'll remember that when a group of women, including Mary Magdalene, came and sought out the disciples to tell them that they'd seen Jesus, they got pretty short shrift, didn't they? This is how Luke describes what happens. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But they didn't believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. In a very Thomas-like fashion, Peter didn't leave matters there, and Luke goes on to tell us that Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying there, and he went away wondering to himself what had happened. But he saw for himself. Perhaps it's because there are some last glimmers of remembrance of a degree that I once took in physics, but I enjoy the science documentaries that come on television. Brian Cox, for example, is a great communicator and shows, I think, just the right amount of enthusiasm and awe, although he does sometimes go a bit over the top. He talks about the wonders of the universe, and he really does see them as being wonders. I've also come across another science populist who made a documentary on the BBC a few years ago. It was a short series, and in this, Professor Jim Al-Khalili took us through the way that our understanding of the beginning and end of the universe has changed over time. Now, I guess that I've grown up with the Big Bang being the predominant theory for how the universe began. Science has determined over the course of about the last 100 years that the universe is not a constant, infinite entity, but it had a beginning and it's expanding. Now, while Christian people have different views about how God created the world, the contemporary scientific view seems to fit better with the idea of creation than the previous constant, infinite idea. However the universe began, Christian people believe that God was in some way involved and that there was a beginning. That science and faith coexist in relation to the universe's origins better now than they have done in the past is an interesting point, I think. The second interesting fact sort of connects to the first. Having taken a science degree and a PhD in Belgium, Georges Lemaitre did postdoctoral studies in Cambridge and then at Harvard and MIT in the United States. He went back to Belgium just over 100 years ago, 1925, and 2 years later, while teaching as a part-time lecturer at Leuven University, Lemaitre became the first person, I understand, to publish the theory that will become known as the Big Bang. What is especially interesting is Dr. Lemaitre's parallel career. Dr. Georges Lemaitre was also known as Monseigneur Georges Lemaitre. After studying maths and science in his first degree, he entered a Catholic seminary to prepare to be a parish priest. However, his teachers at the seminary could see that his great talent was in the field of science, and after he finished his training, they pointed him towards his research in that area. But he always wore his clerical collar while lecturing at the university. We've got a picture of him here doing just that. There we are. Somebody will probably know what that squiggle means on the board, but I certainly don't. Monseigneur Lemaitre's twin vocations, science and faith, have tended to confuse people. In his documentary, Jim Al-Khalili slightly raised an eyebrow at what he called Lemaitre's dog collar, and he described him as having a curious dual role. Now, Jim Al-Khalili must not have looked at the impressive Wikipedia list of Roman Catholic clergy who've also been responsible for some groundbreaking scientific discoveries. For example, Nicholas Copernicus, Gregor Mendel, and Roger Bacon. In the modern era in this country, Sir John Polkinghorne, one-time professor of mathematical physics at Cambridge, was an Anglican priest. He was also no slouch in the lecture room. Georges Lemaitre is referred to in one of Dan Brown's novels. I hope you haven't read any of these. They're rubbish. Don't, please. Sorry, I hope I haven't offended anybody there. He was referred to in the Dan Brown novels as a monk who wanted to prove the existence of God, as was the case with Dan Brown's more famous The Da Vinci Code. This is inaccurate in so many ways. Lemaitre was never a monk, and nor did he seek to prove the existence of God. If anything, he spoke out against those who sought to use science to prove God. In 1951, he got into a bit of an argument with Pope Pius XII. The Pope, presumably not a man familiar with the subtle nuances of modern cosmology, was all over Lemaitre's theory of the Big Bang because, like Dan Brown, he thought that it proved that Genesis 1 and 2 were literally true. Lemaitre wasn't at all happy with any of this, believing that this embarrassed him amongst his scientific colleagues. And he himself saw no conflict between these two areas of his life and commented, "There are two ways of pursuing the truth, and I decided to follow both." Now, I get the feeling that Thomas could have been one of these scientific clerics. He certainly liked to test a theory before he would accept it as truth, but he was also brave, being willing to ask the questions that a scientist needs to ask, regardless of the consequences. But when he did see, he was able to express his faith in a more profound way than was the case with the others who had seen Jesus on that previous occasion. Let's look again at our Caravaggio picture. As well as Jesus and Thomas, there are two disciples in the background. It's assuming that one of these is Peter, the one with the shiny, balding head. It isn't easy to see the look in their eyes, but they're clearly caught up in what is happening in front of them. They're focused on the very point where Thomas's finger enters Jesus' ribs. Now, this is the second time that they've seen their resurrected Lord, but now one of their number is actually looking like they might touch Jesus. Indeed, in our picture, actually going to place his finger in the wound. Although these figures are in the background, they are intriguing because they could be seen as representing the intense interest of the church whenever Jesus draws someone closer to himself, whenever someone reaches out to Jesus. You see, in a way, they are us, those two, Peter and the other disciple, because we long to see, don't we, children and adults come to faith. That excites us. Christian people love seeing this. We are delighted when a person starts taking a greater interest in worship or wants to become more involved in the life of the fellowship. Witnessing this is not idle curiosity. It's actually a gift to us from God. Someone else's enthusiasm strengthens our own faith. Perhaps we see ourselves in this scene because we need to be reminded, as Thomas in encounter is reminding his colleagues, that yes, it's true, Jesus has risen from the dead and God has won the victory. Blessed are those who believe without seeing, says Jesus, but seeing others believe is also a blessing to us, indeed a much needed one. One final thought concerning Thomas and his missed opportunity in science. People used to talk about the omnipotence of sixth formers, meaning that at that time in a person's life, they think they know about everything and can be certain about everything that they do know. I think it's probably true to say that the best scientists find that the more that they know, the more they realize how much there is still to know. One eminent 20th century theologian claims that doubt is in fact an inescapable and essential part of faith. Because we are limited in our understanding, there will always be things about the infinite nature and the character of God that we can't understand, try as we might. And yet it is important to try, because an unquestioning faith is no faith at all, because it shows a lack of engagement with God. I sometimes wonder whether doubt is actually the right word to use, and that Christian people should admit that in many areas regarding God, they are agnostic, literally meaning not knowing. I wonder if Thomas's story is less about doubting and more about not knowing and how to deal with that. A questioning faith requires an element of risk and more than a little courage. To ask a question is to risk an answer. As that same theologian puts it, where there is daring and courage, there is the possibility of failure. Sometimes we ask questions and we receive no answer. Sometimes we ask questions and don't like the answer we receive. These are the risks that we take when we honestly engage with God. Thomas is a devoted follower of Jesus. This is probably why he doubts the truth of the resurrection stories. To suggest that his beloved rabbi is back from the dead seems disrespectful, a fairy tale that undermines the message that Jesus delivered, it undermines his ministry. Of course, Thomas is deeply skeptical, and really who can blame him? In truth, the Easter story raises more questions than it answers, but we have to take these questions seriously. After all, the stakes are high. If true, the resurrection is an extraordinary event with life-changing implications. If Jesus, who was crucified, who died and was buried, has been raised, then all bets are off about what we thought about life and our place in it. He's not just another wise man. He's not just a champion of the oppressed. He's the Christ, the Son of God. And so he might expect a lot more of us, his followers. Easter is the time of year when Christians ask themselves two questions, says the American writer Garrison Keillor. Do I really believe all this stuff? And if so, why do I live this way? Perhaps Thomas knows exactly what's at stake, and this makes him willing to express his doubts without giving up on faith. If we think carefully about this story, we see that Thomas must have stayed with the other disciples, even though he didn't share in what he might have considered to be their resurrection fantasy. A week later, Jesus reappeared and told Thomas to touch the holes in his hands, to touch the wounds in his side. And were these words maybe a rebuke from Jesus, or was he being kind in reaching out to Thomas and his doubts? Perhaps we can imagine Thomas and his feelings as he says, "My Lord and my God." Encountering the risen Christ, Thomas has the answer he was searching for, and it transforms him. There's another painting more famous than any of Caravaggio's that shows another finger, or rather two fingers. Could we have the next picture, please? This is a section from the creation of Adam. On the right, we see God, and on the left, Adam, their fingers touching. Or are they? Can we see the next one? The two fingers come close, but they don't actually touch. There is space, albeit a very small space, in the context of a painting as a whole, which fills the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. But there is a space between their fingertips. In the same way, there is a space between Thomas's finger and Jesus' side. And that space is bridged by mystery and in turn by faith. You see, as I've said before, I don't think that Thomas did touch Jesus. There was a gap in between. He saw with his own eyes and he believed, and he became aware of the central mystery of the Gospel of John, how the Word of God became flesh and lived among us. Those scientists who are the best communicators, I think, have a great respect for mystery. They best know what they know and what they don't know. And when they approach a boundary between the two, they gaze into the unknown with profound respect and awe, walking by faith as well as by sight. Our relationship with Jesus is not dependent upon finding proof, but in that gap between our finger and God's, being bridged by our faith and by God's Spirit. There's something like a charge of electricity, and the gap is leapt. Our faith and God's Spirit. This is not a story told to demand unquestioning faith of us. It's one about a Saviour who came back to an upper room precisely because he knew Thomas didn't have unquestioning faith. Jesus came back again just to find Thomas because he loved Thomas. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, who came back to find the one who got away, who came back to find us. Amen.